a bowl of pasta, and a timeline full of knots. Welcome to Marple Inquiry. I am your host, Montague. Join the conversation. Drop your city or country in the comments. I'm always excited to see where you're watching from. Let's begin. When it comes to disruptions in the daily rhythm of life at West 35th Street, there are tiers. You've got your routine ones, like Inspector Kramer barging in without wiping his shoes, or Wolfe flying into a rare rage because Fritz oversalted the Cervellas. And then there are the wild cards, the ones that sneak in under the guise of a harmless favor and somehow upend the whole works like a bowling ball through a pane of stained glass. This one started with a fork, a literal one. It was Tuesday, just after 11 in the morning, and I was halfway through the sports section when the bell rang. Wolfe, of course, did not twitch a muscle in the direction of the door. That duty, as always, fell to me, the loyal legman, receptionist, muscle and part-time comic relief. The man standing outside looked like he'd taken a wrong turn on the way to an Italian cooking show. Slim, sharp-jawed and expensively rumpled, he had a silver pasta fork, yes, fork, tucked under his arm like a violin. He wore a camel hair coat over a dark turtleneck and held a cardboard pastry box that smelled suspiciously like cannoli. There was also a tension about him, one of those low-level vibrations that meant trouble was sitting on the burner, just waiting to boil. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked, voice rich like roasted espresso. "Last time I checked." I opened the door, wider. "And if you've brought that fork to duel over the last table at Trattoria Roma, you're 10 years too late and a lawsuit short." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No duel. My name is Carlo Verdicchio. I'd like to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It's a matter of culinary ethics." That last part made me blink. I've heard a lot of reasons people want to see Nero. Wolfe, blackmail, family feuds, missing jewels. But I can't say I'd ever heard anyone lead with culinary ethics. It was gutsy, or crazy. I gave him a once-over, then the fork. "Is that decorative, or have you actually used that thing on spaghetti?" His face tightened. "It's a prototype, from my father's restaurant. Or was." "Ah," I said, stepping the side. "Well, bring your fork and your story in. Just don't wave it around. Wolfe's not fond of theatrics this early in the day." Inside, I led him to the office. Wolfe, as expected, was planted in his oversized throne, surrounded by the golden glow of midday peace, sipping beer and digesting breakfast like a man with no plans to stand up until at least October. His expression, when I introduced Verdicchio, was politely bored. But his eyes flicked to the fork, and then to the man's face, and something behind them narrowed, just slightly. "I told your secretary this concerns culinary ethics," Verdicchio began, seating himself carefully. "But that was only to secure the appointment. The truth is uglier. I believe someone sabotaged my father's legacy, and if I'm right, someone's willing to ruin a life over a plate of spaghetti." Wolfe reached for his beer. "I am not, sir, a crusader for the wounded honor of restaurateurs. Even when the sabotage might involve theft, intellectual fraud, and a recipe that never should have seen the light of day." That made Wolfe pause. His eyebrows twitched, a sure sign he was at least mildly piqued. I took it as a good sign and sat down. Verdicchio set the pastry box on the desk and opened it slowly, like he was revealing evidence. Inside were 4 neatly wrapped cannoli and a sealed envelope. My father, Aldo Verdicchio, ran Il Vero Sapore for 30 years. His spaghetti alla Verdicchio was the centerpiece, simple, elegant, irreplicable. He died last year. 2 months ago, the recipe showed up on the menu of a rival chef, a man my father once mentored, Enzo Latari. A familiar name, Wolfe murmured, eyes on the box. A self-styled culinary disruptor, I believe. Yes, Enzo claims it's his, but it's not. And worse, he's profiting from it, claiming awards, fame. There's no legal way to prove recipe theft. But I believe he didn't act alone. There's more to this than kitchen envy. I tilted my head. And what's in the envelope? Verdicchio slid it over to Wolfe. A letter. My father's last. He mentioned Wolfe by name. Wolfe stiffened just a fraction, then reached out to take it. That, for him, was the equivalent of an audible gasp. He read in silence. When he looked up, his eyes had sharpened. Mr. Verdicchio, I do not enjoy being maneuvered, but this letter, he held it delicately between two fingers. This merits attention, he turned to me. Archie, inform Mr. Verdicchio that I will consider his matter, pending an investigation into the facts, and then take him downstairs. I want details. Names, timelines, relationships, enemies, and above all, the ingredients. I nodded. You got it. And the fork, Wolfe made a face. Remove it from my sight. Verdicchio smiled faintly, perhaps the first real smile of the morning. He stood, clutching his prototype like a talisman. As we left the room, Wolfe turned the envelope over in, his hand once like weighing a rare spice. Behind him, the brownstone hummed with its usual calm, but something had shifted. And if I've learned anything in all my years with Wolfe, it's that once the kitchen of fate starts to simmer, you better have your apron on. By the time I led Carlo Verdicchio down to the front room, the fork was tucked safely under his arm like a banner of dubious honor, and I had a notebook in my jacket pocket itching to get filled. I've interviewed enough clients to know when someone's holding back, and our guest had the kind of careful speech that meant there was more marinara under the surface than he wanted to admit. We took the chairs by the window, the morning sun, cutting through the blinds just enough to make the cannoli box gleam like it belonged on an altar. I offered him a glass of water. He declined, eyes fixed on the carpet like it held the answer to his family's downfall. All right, I said, flipping open the notebook. Let's rewind a bit. Your father, Aldo Verdicchio, he owned Il Vero Sapore. Give me the short version of his history, the recipe, and this Enzo Latari character. Carlo nodded slowly. My father immigrated from Palermo in the late 70s. He started in kitchens, the usual grind, until he opened Il Vero Sapore in 1993. He was a traditionalist. Everything. From scratch, no substitutions. He trained maybe 6 or 7 sous chefs over the years. Enzo was the last, the most ambitious. He left in 2021 to open his own place, Ossidiana. I jotted down the names and dates. And the spaghetti? That was my father's pride. He used to say you could taste his childhood in it. Anchovy paste, Calabrian chilies, breadcrumbs toasted in olive oil. But the real trick was the broth. He never told anyone how he made it, not even me. But now it's on Enzo's menu. Carlo nodded, bitterness curling his mouth. Almost note for note. He calls it spaghetti a modo mio, but I tasted it. It's my father's dish. The difference is, Enzo's version is showier. He smokes the tomatoes, shaves truffle, puts it under a glass dome, but the bones of it, it's stolen. And this letter Wolfe's reading upstairs, your father wrote it before he died. Yes, 3 days before. He was sick with pneumonia. He'd been in and out of the hospital. I didn't know he'd written it until I went through his desk. He mentioned Wolfe by name, said if anything happened to his recipe, Wolfe would know what to do. I thought it was nonsense at first. Then I saw Enzo on a food blog last month bragging about reinventing Italian heritage. I've seen a lot of motives in my time, but few quite so flavorful. Pride, legacy, betrayal, they go down easy with a side of garlic. I tapped the pen against my pad. Let's talk about people. Who had access to the recipe? Besides my father, no one should have. It wasn't written down anywhere as far as I know. But he had regulars, trusted staff. And Enzo worked with him for almost 3 years. If anyone could have memorized it. What about family? My mother died when I was a kid. No siblings. Just me. Employees? He listed a few. Marta, the pastry chef. Leo, a waiter who'd been with Aldo for 20 years, a young line cook named Javi, and a dish hand. Carlo barely knew, all still working at the restaurant which had been inherited by Carlo and, get this, shut down last week for renovations. "You shut it down?" I asked. "I had to," he said. "It was hemorrhaging money, and after my father died, so the place lost its heart. I didn't want to destroy it, but I needed time to figure out what came next, and now—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I could read the rest between the lines. A stolen recipe, a shuttered restaurant, a legacy in ruins. Upstairs I heard a distant thunk, the sound of Wolfe setting down his beer glass. It wasn't a signal, but I've worked with the man long enough to know when the gears have shifted. "Right," I said, standing. "Here's what's going to happen. I'll be taking a stroll to Ossidiana this afternoon. I want to look at the operation, the menu, and the man himself. In the meantime, you stay put. Wolfe may want another word." Carlo nodded, subdued. As I stepped out of the room, I left him with his fork and his cannoli and his tangle of regret. Back upstairs, Wolfe had moved an inch. That was about as good as a standing ovation. He glanced at me as I entered, then nodded once toward the envelope. "Genuine," he said. "The handwriting matches samples of Aldo Verdicchio's on file, with the Department of Consumer Affairs. I had Fritz compare the flourishes. You suspected it might be forged. I allow for possibilities, Archie. It's part of the discipline. Sit." I did. Wolfe steepled his fingers and looked thoughtful, which meant he was about to issue marching orders. "There is something unseemly about the theft of a dish," he said. "It is not protected by patent or copyright. The law is silent on the transmission of flavor. And yet, if this Latari has acquired the recipe through subterfuge or betrayal, it constitutes a moral theft, an appropriation of identity." "That's quite a stand to take," I said. "You turning philosopher on me?" He ignored that. "You will visit this Ossidiana, make no accusations, order the spaghetti, taste it, engage the man, see who surrounds him. I want to know what kind of thief presents himself in the language of innovation." "Got it. And Archie, observe the kitchen if you can. Note if there's anyone who might have once been in Verdicchio's employ." He paused, then added, "And bring back a sample." I grinned. "You want leftovers?" "I want evidence." So at 3:30 I found myself standing in line outside Ossidiana on East 61st. It was the kind of place where the bread basket came with a story, and the menu had its own literary agent. Inside, everything was polished concrete and moody lighting. A waiter with a beard like a woodcut brought me to a table, and I ordered spaghetti a modo mio without hesitation. Arrived under a cloud of rosemary smoke. I poked through it with a fork and took a bite. It was good, disturbingly good, not just in the sense of culinary flair, but in that uncanny way that tells you this wasn't inspired by. This was the thing, a shadow, but a perfect one. The anchovy, the breadcrumbs, even the ghost of the broth. I scanned the room. Near the back, holding court under a massive painting of a squid, was Enzo Latari, sleek, polished, wearing a chef's coat that probably cost more than my rent. He was talking to a woman in a navy pantsuit, but his eyes wandered the room like he was hunting press coverage. As I watched, a man emerged from the kitchen, a line cook, Latino, maybe 20. I caught him wiping his hands on a towel, and for a moment something clicked. I recognized the name, Javi, Verdicchio's kitchen, still working, that was something. I finished the spaghetti and got the check. The bill came in a leather case with a card tucked inside. Tonight only. Chef Latari in conversation with culinary media. Ask for an invitation. I slid it into my pocket. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with a plate of cheese and pears and a look that said he was ready to hear something worthwhile. I placed the takeout box on his desk like it was a crime scene sample. He lifted the lid, sniffed, and grunted. "Well?" "It's his," I said. Not. A variation. A mirror. And Latari's not flying solo. Verdicchio's old line cook is working the back line. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Sabotage, he said softly. By someone who knew both kitchens. And? Wolfe tapped his fingers together. Now we bait the trap. I leaned back. And the bait is? Wolfe's mouth twitched. You, of course, but also pride. No thief can resist showing off to the very man they've wronged. We shall give Mr. Latari that chance. He closed the box with a sniff of finality. Tomorrow we send an invitation, carefully worded. He will come. And, just like that, the brownstone had been stirred. Not by murder this time, but by a theft no less sacrilegious in Wolfe's eyes. The sanctity of a man's palate had been violated, which meant someone, somewhere, was about to get flambéed. Wolfe didn't waste time, which in his case meant he assigned the task of extending the invitation to me, and then promptly retreated to the plant rooms for his 4 o'clock session with the orchids. As usual, the heavy lifting fell to yours truly, and by dinner time the wheels were turning. The message I delivered to Assidiana the next morning was handwritten, by me, of course, and phrased with just enough ego-stroking to reel in a man like Enzo Latari. It read, Chef Latari, Mr. Nero Wolfe has recently encountered your reinterpretation of traditional Sicilian cuisine and would like to invite you to a brief discussion at his residence. He is particularly intrigued by the nuances of your spaghetti, a modo mio. Tomorrow 2 p.m. Nero Wolfe, West 35th Street. Wolfe approved it with a single grunt, which in our code translates to acceptable, though not inspired. I delivered it in person, made sure it got to the maitre d' who promised to pass it along. I could see Latari through the kitchen window, garnishing something with tweezers and a look of divine concentration, like a man baptizing his own ego. At exactly 1:57 the next day, the doorbell rang. I'd been listening for it like a hawk, standing in the hallway with the patience of a man who's seen Wolfe's set pieces play out more than once. When I opened the door, Enzo Latari stood there with the unflappable calm of someone used to interviews, awards, and the smug glow of being the cleverest man in the room. He was shorter than I'd expected, lean, carefully styled, and dressed in an ash-colored blazer with lapels sharp enough to slice pancetta. His shoes probably had their own Instagram account. He didn't smile when I greeted him, just gave a polite nod, like I was a podium, and he was mid-speech. Mr. Wolfe is waiting, I said, and between you and me, he doesn't do small talk. Good, Latari replied, stepping in. Neither do I. He followed me into the office, where Wolfe sat motionless in his chair, hands resting on the armrests like they'd been carved there. The only sound was the faint buzz of traffic outside and the distant purr of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Wolfe didn't stand, he never does, but his eyes opened a fraction wider as they scanned Latari from lapel to loafers. Mr. Latari, Wolfe said, voice cool and clipped, thank you for accepting my invitation. Your note intrigued me, Latari replied, taking the chair I pointed him to. I don't often get summoned by legends. Wolfe offered the shadow of a smile. Flattery is wasted on me. I invited you because I tasted your spaghetti. Latari inclined his head. Ah, then I suppose I should ask if you enjoyed it. I did not, Wolfe said flatly. I recognized it. A flicker passed over Latari's face. Not fear, not yet. More like wariness. He leaned back, folding his hands. It's a reinterpretation, he said smoothly, based on influences, memory, culinary instinct. It is, in fact, Wolfe said, a facsimile of Aldo Verdicchio's spaghetti alla Verdicchio with ornamental deviations. Latari's eyes narrowed, but he kept his tone light. You're a purist, I understand. But cuisine evolves, Mr. Wolfe. Recipes move. They inspire. Not without transmission, Wolfe said. And not with such precision unless the origin was known, which raises questions. Then ask, Latari said, now clearly annoyed. If you believe I stole a recipe, say so. I've been accused of worse. I do not believe, Wolfe replied. I deduce. And my deduction is incomplete. That is why you are here. Latari stared at him for a moment, then glanced at me as if expecting an interruption, a protest, something. I gave him my best poker face. Wolfe doesn't accuse lightly, but when he sets the trap it means the scent is fresh. You worked at Il Vero Sapore, Wolfe continued. You were trained by Aldo Verdicchio. You left 2 years before his death. In that time you developed a culinary brand defined by reinvention, by taking traditional elements and transforming them into spectacle. I prefer the word homage. Semantics, Wolfe snapped. Tell me, Mr. Latari, who currently works in your kitchen? Latari blinked. What relevance? Name them. He rattled off a few names. I waited. Then came the one we were listening for. And Javier Molina, line cook. Wolfe's eyelids fluttered very slightly. Molina was employed by Aldo Verdicchio. There was a pause. That's possible, Latari said. I don't vet every dishwasher's resume. He was more than a dishwasher, Wolfe said. He was present the last 6 months before your departure. The timing is not incidental. My assistant, a slight nod toward me, observed Molina in your kitchen 2 days ago. He was seen preparing sauce components. Latari's jaw clenched, just a fraction. This is ridiculous. I agree, Wolfe said calmly, because the next question is not whether you knew the recipe. It is whether someone gave it to you. I developed that dish myself. Then you will have no objection, Wolfe said, leaning forward an inch, his version of lunging across the desk, to providing your kitchen's recipe logs for the past year, as well as all correspondence with your staff, particularly Molina. There was a silence that stretched just long enough to sweat. I don't owe you anything, Latari said. I came here out of courtesy, and I don't appreciate being interrogated. Yet here you remain, Wolfe said. That hit. Latari rose sharply, brushing imaginary lint off his blazer. This conversation is over. Then permit me one more statement, Wolfe said. If you have taken what does not belong to you, if you have profited from another man's work, past, it offers your own and dishonored a legacy, then I will know. You may leave. Latari hesitated long enough to be telling. Then he turned and walked out, spine straight, footsteps stiff. I saw him to the door. He's sweating, I said when I returned. You hit something, I believe, Wolfe said, settling deeper into his chair. We just saw the first crack, now we widen it. He closed his eyes. Call Saul. Have him begin a background check on Molina. I want employment dates, tax records, and any financial transactions connecting him to Latari in the last 6 months. What are we looking for? A bridge, Wolfe said, between loyalty and betrayal. Someone crossed it. I intend to know who and why. I nodded and reached for the phone. The spaghetti might have been stolen, but the truth was simmering, and Wolfe had just turned up the heat. I put in the call to Saul Panza that afternoon, and if you've ever had the pleasure of working with the man, you know he doesn't waste time or syllables. I gave him the essentials. Javier Molina, late of Il Vero Sapore, now slicing shallots and stirring sauces at Ossidiana. Wolfe wanted dates, money, and any shady signals that might point to a deal behind Aldo Verdicchio's back. Saul didn't say much, just grunted once and hung up. That's how you know he's already started. Wolfe spent the next hour in his chair stewing, not over defeat but over anticipation. That's his thing. He lets the pieces come to him like chess players wandering toward a board they don't know they're on yet. He didn't speak again until Fritz came in with tea and Petty's fours at 5, and even then it was only to request, in a tone that implied mortal insult, that the lemon zest in the shortbread be tempered next time. Which meant, as far as Fritz was concerned, we were at war. By 6:30, Saul had called back. "Got it," he said once I picked up. Molina left Verdicchio's place the same week Latari signed the lease on the new restaurant. Paid in. Cash for a moving service. No forwarding address filed. 2 weeks later, new deposit made to a joint account, his and his sister's, for a little under 10 grand. That's more than a line cook bonus. Exactly. Latari doesn't pay his sous chef that much, let alone his backline. Anything else? Apartment in Harlem, rented under the sister's name. But guess whose mail goes there? I didn't have to guess. You think she's a cutout? Looks that way. And get this. 3 months ago, Molina applied for a small business license in his name. Guess the category? Food services, street food, specialty pasta. It's on hold now, probably waiting for financing. But someone's giving him a long leash. That leash got breadcrumbs on it? Smothered. I hung up and went back to the office. Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, which was not a surprise. Movement in that chair is a rare event, and always meaningful. He paid Molina, I said. 10 grand about the time he started prepping a Sidiana. Registered no forwarding. Used the sister's name for cover. Tried to open his own cart this year. Pasta concept. Wolfe, it's a backdoor handoff. The kid sold him the recipe. Do not need your conclusion, Archie, Wolfe said. I need facts which you have provided competently. That was high praise, by the way. He laced his fingers together and stared at the ceiling for a while, probably mentally reducing the situation to ingredients and measurements. The theft was covert, he said finally. But the flaunting is deliberate. Latari didn't just mimic the recipe. He modified it for theatre, layered it in ego. That is not the act of a man ashamed of stealing. It is the act of a man who believes the theft won't matter. Because it isn't prosecutable, I said. There's no law against copying a dish. No, Wolfe said, but there is law against fraud, against breach of contract, and against conspiracy. If it can be demonstrated that a business was sabotaged through deception, we will not pursue the courts, but we will construct the truth with care, like a souffle, and then serve it to who? To Latari, he said, eyes flashing, with witnesses. The next morning, Wolfe had me make 2 calls, one to Carlo Verdicchio, asking him to return to the brownstone, the other to Marta Rossetti, the pastry chef at Il Vero Sapore. I'd clocked the name before, but now Wolfe wanted her in the room. She remained loyal to Aldo, he said. If anyone outside the family knew his concerns, it may be her. Verdicchio arrived first, dressed better than the last time. No prototype fork this time, but he still looked like a man carrying something fragile and unforgiven. He sat stiffly and kept his hands in his lap. Marta arrived 10 minutes later. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, no-nonsense, the kind of woman who could balance a half-dozen orders and a vendetta at the same time. She greeted Wolfe with something just shy of suspicion and took the seat I indicated without a word. Wolfe began without preamble. Ms. Rossetti, you worked under Aldo Verdicchio for 16 years. 17, she corrected. He hired me when I was fresh out of culinary school. And you were present when Enzo Latari joined the kitchen? She nodded. I trained him. He was talented but ambitious, too fast for his own good. Did you observe any tension between Aldo and Enzo? She folded her arms. Aldo liked him, respected his palate, but he didn't trust him. Not fully. Did Aldo ever share the spaghetti recipe? No, she said sharp. Never. He didn't even let me watch him make the broth, and I was closer to him than anyone else there. Yet you believe Latari knew it. Her expression darkened. After Aldo died, I went to Ossidiana once, out of curiosity. I ordered the spaghetti, the first bite. I knew. That wasn't imitation. That was theft. Wolfe turned to Carlo. Mr. Verdicchio, your father left no written record of the recipe. No, he said. I've looked. He said it lived in his head. And no employees were aware of the method? Just him. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, show her. I opened the manila folder Wolfe had prepared and handed Marta the printout from Saul. Molina's pay history, the cash deposit, the business filing, the connection to Latari. She read it slowly. When she looked up, her face was stormy. Sold it, she said. That little sneak. He hung around Aldo's station, took out the trash, cleaned the pots, always polite, always quiet. Aldo thought he was harmless. People often misjudge the quiet ones, Wolfe said. She handed the folder back. So what now, you going to expose him? Indeed, Wolfe said. But not yet. We require one more ingredient. He turned to Carlo again. You will go to Latari. You will confront him, not with accusation, but with admiration. You will pretend to forgive. You will offer to partner with him on a revival of Il Vero Sapore. Carlo blinked. You want me to what? Pretend I admire him? Exactly, Wolfe said. You will praise him, praise his success, mention your father's pride, and suggest that you two collaborate, on paper, publicly, with contracts. Insist on preserving the family legacy. Appeal to his ego. He will not resist. And what's the goal? Carlo asked. To draw him out, Wolfe said. If he believes you've surrendered your grievance, he may admit the theft. Or better, propose terms that reveal it. We shall be listening. Carlo looked at me, then back at Wolfe. You really think that'll work? I do, Wolfe said, because a man who steals does not want silence. He wants approval, and he cannot resist showing his prize. I escorted them both out. Marta said nothing, but gave me a look on the way that said she'd like 5 minutes alone with a rolling pin and Latari's kneecaps. Carlo seemed less certain, but he left with the air of a man who finally had a direction to walk. That night the brownstone was quiet again, but the trap was set, and this time we weren't baiting with words. We were baiting with pride. To hand it to Carlo Verdicchio. He played his part better than I expected. I gave him a few coaching tips before his meeting with Latari. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep him from snarling like a wounded hare. Wolfe had instructed him to offer a hand and keep his pride in his pocket, and Carlo, to his credit, tucked it away without much protest. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but in this case it had to be dressed up as reconciliation and plated with flattery. The meeting happened that Friday afternoon at Ossidiana. Carlo made sure I was nearby, not visible but within earshot. I took a seat at the bar with a paper and a Negroni and waited for the show. Carlo was ushered in by the hostess, and after a brief exchange, Latari emerged from the back, looking wary but intrigued. They sat at a corner table near the wine rack. I sipped my drink and watched the two men through the mirror behind the bar. From where I sat, the exchange was mostly quiet and civil. Carlo did a good job. He smiled, gestured with open palms, leaned forward like a man laying down his sword. I caught the words legacy, how to partnership and honor my father, drifting across the clink of cutlery. Latari listened, chin high, wearing that too smooth smile he wore like a second skin. When Carlo said something that made him laugh, probably a compliment he didn't deserve, I saw his posture change. He leaned back, relaxed. His ego had taken the bait. 10 minutes in, I caught the phrase, "We could draft something." And that's when my antennae started buzzing. Another 5 minutes and they shook hands. Carlo stood, nodded and walked out without looking back. I gave him a few beats, paid the tab, and followed. We met a block away under a scaffolding where the shadows were thick and the traffic noise helped keep conversations private. Well, I asked. Carlo exhaled. He bought it. He said it was overdue, that we could rewrite the narrative together. He even called it poetic. I grimaced. Poetic. Right. Did he bite hard enough to bleed? Close. He suggested we co-author a cookbook, Aldo's recipes, with Enzo's reinterpretations. Said we'd capture the evolution of flavor. Wolfe was going to love that. And then, Carlo continued, he said something strange. He told me he'd wanted to approach me months ago, but he didn't think I was ready. He said, Javi thought you were too sentimental to see the opportunity. I stiffened. He said that? Yeah. I didn't know what to say. You didn't need to. That's the thread we pull. I left Carlo with instructions to hold off on further communication and headed straight back to the brownstone. Wolfe was in the office with a book open on his lap and a plate of poached pears, untouched on the desk. He looked up as I entered, his expression suggesting I had 2 minutes to justify interrupting his reading. I did it in 30 seconds. He credited Molina, said Molina told him Carlo was too sentimental. That's admission by implication, Wolfe. It puts Molina and Latari in direct dialogue about the theft. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. As I expected, men who steal are not content with silence. They need an audience, even in whispers. He offered a cookbook deal. Wants to rebrand. The theft as tribute. Wolfe grunted. Their classic gambit. Take what you cannot defend and disguise it as collaboration. Now we isolate the mechanism. He rang for Fritz and asked for coffee, which meant he was preparing to think. What are we missing? I asked. We've got motive means connection and a verbal thread. What's left? Physicality, Wolfe murmured. Something tangible. Words are powerful, but there must be one detail, something overlooked, something small but specific, that links the theft irreversibly to its source. He closed the book in his lap. It was a culinary volume on Sicilian broths. Of course. I want the original kitchen inspected. Il vero sapore. Before it is gutted or sold. Archie, contact the building manager. Use Verdicchio's name. I want access by tomorrow. I made the call that night. The manager agreed. Half out of politeness, half because the name Verdicchio still held weight on the block. We had a 10 a.m. slot the next morning, and I dragged Carlo along as my local guide. Il vero sapore was dark, shuttered, and faintly sad, like a theatre waiting for a demolition notice. Dust coated the floor in soft patches, and the kitchen still held the ghosts of busy nights. Burnt spots on the range, handwritten labels on spice tins, a pair of cracked ramekins stacked on a counter. Carlo moved slowly through the space like a man walking through a memory. I let him have a moment, then got to work. I photographed everything, the pantry, the walk-in, the prep station, the stove. I checked drawers, examined shelves, flipped open every pot lid. I even climbed halfway under the sink. Nothing obvious stood out. And then Carlo said quietly, "Wait." He was staring at a narrow cabinet beneath the spice rack. He opened it and reached in. My father used to keep a recipe journal, not with instructions, just notes, ideas, variations, sketches of flavor. The cabinet had a false back, barely perceptible. Carlo tugged. A panel popped loose. Inside, in a plastic sleeve, was a single sheet of lined paper, old-stained and covered in small, tight handwriting. He handed it to me. At the top, in Aldo's scrawl, Brodo alla verità, base segreta. Beneath it, 4 ingredients, no amounts, just names. One of them was dried lemon leaves, the same. Flavor note I'd caught barely, under the smoke in Latari's version. Wolfe had said he needed something tangible. Well, this was tangible enough to knock over a house of cards. I called Wolfe from the street. "We have it," I said. "The broth base, hidden in the kitchen, 4 ingredients. One of them, lemon leaves. You taste it in Latari's dish if you know to look." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Return immediately, bring the page." And Carlo. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe handled the sheet with gloved hands, like it was a lost Rembrandt. He read it once, then again, and then handed it to me. "This," he said, "is what the law would call a trade secret. It is not a recipe. It is the soul of one, and it predates the theft." Carlo sat stiffly in the chair across from the desk. "What? do we do with it?" he asked. "We use it," Wolfe said. "We summon." That afternoon I made the calls. Latari, Marta, Saul, Molina through his sister's number, which Saul had acquired. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Wolfe wanted everyone in the room. The ACU office would be full, and the truth, tangled in pasta and ego, was about to be served. The next day, at precisely 2 p.m., the office at West 35th Street held more bodies than Wolfe preferred, and far more tension than the walls were used to absorbing. Saul, Panzer leaned against the bookcase, eyes calm but alert. Marta Rossetti sat near the window, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the carpet with the kind of stillness that usually precedes a storm. Carlo Verdicchio occupied his usual seat beside the globe stand, visibly trying not to fidget. Javier Molina, who had arrived 5 minutes early and hadn't said a word since, looked like a man who'd accidentally wandered into a courtroom. And Enzo Latari, of course, had shown up wearing his best armor, a pale blue blazer, silk pocket, square, and that irritating half-smile he wore like cologne. Wolfe, as always, hadn't moved an inch since they entered. He waited until I'd closed the door and taken my place by the red leather chair before lifting his chin. "I thank you all for coming," he said, his voice measured and cool. "This gathering is not social. It is not a courtesy. It is the final step in the clarification of a sequence of events that began with theft, passed through deception, and ends today, here, with the truth." Latari raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Wolfe didn't give him a chance. "You have, Mr. Latari, made yourself the public face of a culinary triumph. Your spaghetti, a modo mio, has been lauded for its reinvention of traditional Sicilian flavors. You have not hesitated to claim ownership of its design. You have, in fact, capitalized on the illusion of innovation." "Are you accusing me of something?" Latari asked, lips curling slightly. "Because if this is about culinary plagiarism, I've said before, I'm inspired by—" "You are not inspired," Wolfe cut in, his voice rising by half a degree. "You are appropriating, and not through instinct or accident. You have, at best, knowingly built your signature dish on a stolen foundation, and at worst conspired to obtain it." Latari glanced at Molina, who sat frozen, eyes down. Wolfe saw the flicker. Molina was employed by Aldo Verdicchio in the final year of his life, a quiet boy, unnoticed, except by you. After your departure from Il Vero Sapore, you remained in contact with him. "I don't—" Molina began. "Silence," Wolfe said. It wasn't loud, but it dropped like stone into water. Molina shrank. "You paid Molina $10,000 shortly after you acquired your lease," Wolfe continued. "He moved without a forwarding address. He joined your kitchen undercover. You claim, Mr. Latari, that your dish is original, and yet it features, among other ingredients, a precise flavor note, dried lemon leaf, that Aldo Verdicchio used only in one undocumented preparation. A broth, the base of the original spaghetti alla Verdicchio." Wolfe nodded at me, and I stepped forward, handing the plastic sleeve to Saul, who passed it to Marta. Her face hardened as she read. "That's Aldo's writing. That's his paper. I remember that sleeve. He kept it behind the spice rack." She handed it to Carlo, who stared at it like it was a letter from the dead. "My father called this brodo alla verità," he said quietly. "The truth broth." "Appropriate," Wolfe said. "This paper was found in a concealed compartment in the original kitchen, still sealed, forgotten by all except its creator. It confirms, without question, that the unique structure of your dish is not yours, Mr. Latari. It is his, and you obtained it through Mr. Molina." Now Wolfe turned his gaze full on Molina, who was visibly sweating. The room was silent. "Would you like to amend your silence, Mr. Molina?" Molina swallowed. I didn't mean to. He told me. It was an homage. That it would honor Aldo, he said no one would know. And he offered me a real job, better pay. I was just a dishwasher. Dishwashers do not memorize flavor balances, Wolfe said. You studied him. You watched. You listened. And then you sold. I needed money, Molina whispered. You betrayed trust, Wolfe replied. And you, Mr. Latari, you built a lie on top of that betrayal and served it to the public with truffle shavings and self-congratulation. Latari stood up, but Wolfe's voice pinned him in place. You may leave, but understand, this deception is no longer hidden. The evidence will be published. Carlo Verdicchio will reclaim his father's name, publicly and with authority. If you attempt to challenge it, you will face exposure, documented, corroborated, and complete. You have no legal ground, Latari said, voice cold now. Perhaps not, Wolfe said. But in the court of public taste, your currency is reputation, and I assure you it will devalue quickly. Latari looked at Carlo. For the first time, his confidence cracked. This is your idea of revenge? Carlo stood slowly. This is justice, and your name won't be on my father's book. Molina stood too, but said nothing. He looked like he might cry. Saul stepped forward and guided both men to the door. Latari left without looking back. When they were gone, Wolfe exhaled. Marta shook her head. I can't believe it. All that work Aldo put into that dish, and he almost got erased. Not erased, Wolfe said. Just stolen from, which in my opinion is far worse. She nodded once, gave Carlo a brief squeeze on the shoulder, and left. Carlo lingered. I don't know how to thank you, he said. Then don't, Wolfe replied. Use your father's legacy wisely. If you publish, do so with integrity. And stay out of restaurants where smoke is used to obscure more than flavor. Carlo smiled faintly and left us. The brownstone fell quiet again. I glanced at Wolfe. Satisfied? Reached for his beer. No, I abhor theft, especially when it is served warm and garnished with applause, but I am content. I waited. He took a sip, then muttered, Truffle. Huh. I sat down and opened my notebook. Another case closed. No bullets fired, no bodies buried, just lies scraped clean off the plate. And as Fritz entered with dinner, I caught the smell of lemon and anchovy. Wolfe didn't say it, but I knew. Tonight's meal was spaghetti alla verdicchio, the original untangled. Wolfe didn't say a word as Fritz served dinner that night, but the aroma coming from the platter said plenty. The pasta glistened with oil. The breadcrumbs were toasted to just the right edge of brown, and the anchovy base was warm and rich beneath the lemon's quiet sharpness. There was no theatrical dome, no garnish aimed at a camera. Just the dish. Pure. Balanced and finally back where it belonged. Wolfe ate with his usual deliberate calm, though he did allow himself a small nod after the second bite. Fritz hovered for a moment, searching his face for approval. Wolfe gave it as always, without expression. Quite good, he said, then added, though the heat could tolerate a trace more Calabrian chili. Fritz beamed and withdrew. I forked up a bite and let the flavor settle. It was sharp and layered, the kind of taste that earned silence. Wolfe had chased down a lie and reclaimed something better than bragging rights. A recipe isn't just food, it's a memory encoded in flavor. Aldo Verdicchio had tried to guard that memory with silence, and it took Wolfe's particular brand of noise to drag the truth into the light. After dessert, pear tarts with a thread of balsamic syrup, Wolfe leaned back in his chair and reached for his beer. He didn't speak right away, which usually means something is still chewing at the corners of his mind. I gave him a minute, then said, So that's that. The thief's been unmasked. The heir gets to rewrite the ending and the kitchen ghost can rest. I dislike dramatics, Wolfe muttered. Then I'll skip the curtain call. But admit it, that was a good day's work. It was necessary, he said, which is not the same as satisfying. Justice, Archie, is not always accompanied by applause. Sometimes it simply prevents further insult. You think Latari will vanish? No, Wolfe said, but he will pivot. Publicly, perhaps even gracefully. He will say he was honoring the past misquoted in his ambition and eager to reconcile. But the damage is done. Those who matter will know. He paused, tapping a finger against the side of his glass. I have no doubt he will attempt to publish, likely under a different theme, but the flavor he attempted to appropriate has been restored to its rightful origin. That is the closest. We will come to rectitude. Not to mention that Carlo's already been contacted by a culinary magazine. He's getting coverage next month. Marta's putting the pieces together for a relaunch. Wolfe made a sound like an approving grunt, but didn't lift his eyes. And what about Melina? I asked. You think he'll stay in New York after this? He will do what young men who are caught usually do, retreat, justify, rationalize, but perhaps in time he will learn that silence is not the same as forgiveness. I nodded, finishing my drink. The office was dark by then, the night closing around the house like a curtain. The scent of lemon and anchovy still lingered faintly, like a ghost that hadn't quite figured out how to leave. The next morning, I got the call I half expected and half hoped wouldn't come. Latari's PR firm had issued a statement. Wolfe. Let me read it aloud at breakfast, since he refused to touch the newspaper when it carried anything less than full-page obituaries or garden articles. Chef Enzo Latari is honored to acknowledge the influence of Aldo Verdicchio in his culinary journey and regrets any misunderstandings regarding attribution. In collaboration with the Verdicchio estate, he looks forward to celebrating the legacy of Italian cuisine through future projects that bridge tradition and innovation. Wolfe rolled his eyes. He lies with polish. He lies with practice, I said, but not without restraint. That's as close to a confession as he's going to get while keeping his investors happy. Wolfe didn't respond. He was spreading quince paste on a slice of toasted bread with more focus than most men. Bring to emergency surgery. Later that afternoon, Carlo called to confirm what we already suspected. The magazine article had been bumped to a feature, complete with a recipe excerpt and a historical sidebar about his father's influence. Marta was heading the test kitchen for the piece. And as a cherry on top, a local restaurant group had offered to invest in a revival of Il Vero Sapore, on the condition that Carlo retain full creative control and publish a companion book with Marta. Wolfe will be mentioned, Carlo said. Over the line. He won't be named directly, but you'll be thanked, quietly in the acknowledgements. Wolfe, who had taken the call on speaker out of sheer laziness, said only, "Spare me," and hung up. But the corner of his mouth twitched. Afterward, I noticed. That evening after dinner, I was cataloguing receipts when Wolfe spoke again, quietly, almost like he was thinking aloud. Flavor is the last honest record, he said. I looked up. Come again. When people lie, he said, they change their words, they adjust memory. But flavor remains precise. It cannot lie about its origin. It tells the truth to any tongue trained to hear it. I jotted it down. Wolfe wouldn't care, but maybe one day someone would. You going to write a book? I asked. Wolfe on flavor, he scoffed. What nonsense, I'm surrounded by books. Why add another? Because some people don't listen unless it's printed and bound. Then they don't deserve to know. I dropped the subject. Some arguments are like soufflés, poke too hard, and the whole thing deflates. As the hours wound down and the brownstone fell back into its natural state, quiet, dense, insulated from the ridiculousness of the world outside, I poured myself a last cup of coffee and leaned against the doorframe of the office. You know, I said, for a guy who won't stand up to chase a cab or climb a flight of stairs, you've got a pretty strong sense of justice. Wolfe glanced at me unimpressed. Justice, he said, requires neither motion nor muscle, only clarity, and the patience to wait for others to catch up. I lifted my cup. To clarity, then. He didn't raise his glass, but he did nod, and that in our line of work is better than applause. The next few days passed with the kind of silence that Wolfe thrives on. No visitors, no interruptions, no emergencies. The orchids were back in his care at their appointed hours. Fritz resumed cooking meals not tied to moral restitution, and I managed to catch up on my stack of expense reports without Wolfe snapping at me about ink quality or paper noise. But peace in the brownstone never means the world outside has gone quiet. There's always a ripple, especially after a man like Enzo Latari takes a public stumble. The culinary press didn't outright accuse him of theft, of course. They're too polite for that, but the language had changed. Questioned origins, legacy controversy, a reckoning of credit and inspiration. All buzzwords that circle a reputation like vultures around a roast. Wolfe read none of it. But I clipped the articles anyway, just in case. Around the middle of the week, I got a call from Marta. She wanted to drop something off in person. When I told Wolfe, he lifted an eyebrow and muttered something about interruptions becoming fashionable. Still, he didn't object. She arrived late in the afternoon, carrying a slim folder and a paper-wrapped box. I showed her into the office, and she didn't sit until Wolfe gave her the barest nod of acknowledgement. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Properly." "That is not necessary," Wolfe replied. "You provided clear observations and consistent testimony. Gratitude is unneeded." "Well, you're getting it anyway," she said, unwrapping the box and placing it on the desk. "From both of us. Carlo sends his thanks too." The smell hit first. Sugar, lemon, toasted almonds. It was a crostata, simple and elegant. Wolfe, who typically regards unsanctioned pastry offerings with the suspicion of a man checking for cyanide, leaned forward and actually inhaled. That was as close to a swoon as he gets. Marta opened the folder next and slid a page across the desk. "This is the preface. Carlo and I are publishing the book under his father's name, but we included a dedication. You'll see it here." Wolfe reached for it, adjusted his glasses and read in silence. I peeked over his shoulder, "To the guardians of truth, for preserving what matters more than recognition, authenticity, flavor, and the memory of those who taught us to taste with care." He handed it back without comment. Marta nodded, a faint smile flickering. "That's as close to a literary bow as we could manage." "Acceptable," Wolfe murmured. "Though the word truth is often abused, it is not unwelcome in this context. I'll take that as approval." She didn't linger. After a few more polite words, she took her leave and Wolfe allowed Fritz to plate the crostata. He took a single bite, closed his eyes for a moment, then continued eating without speaking, which from him was thunderous praise. I leaned against the edge of the desk and watched the fork movements with the kind of admiration that comes from seeing a case unwind, not with sirens and shackles, but with something better. Resolution. Not perfect. There were no formal charges, no dramatic ruin, but true enough, the lie had been exposed, the legacy preserved. That was as good a win as we get in this line of work. "Do you think Latari's learned anything?" I asked. Wolfe chewed, then swallowed. "He has learned restraint," he said, "which in men like him is the closest approximation to remorse." "Think he'll try again?" "Of course," Wolfe said. "The compulsion to take what belongs to others is not easily cured. But now he will do so under scrutiny. And the next time he layers his arrogance over someone else's labor, he will know we are watching." He reached for his beer and sipped. "And what about Molina?" I asked. "He's still employed?" "He has been retained by Ossidiana for now," Wolfe said. "But I imagine his days are numbered. Thieves who know the secrets are dangerous only so long as they remain useful. And Latari will not tolerate weakness in his scaffolding. You're feeling philosophical tonight." "Hardly," Wolfe said, "only observant." There was a pause. "I may write a letter," he added, almost absently. I blinked. "To whom?" "To the editor of Gastronome. They printed an interview with Latari last year, full of praise. I think it would be educational to submit a brief note correcting the misattribution." "Under your name?" "Of course not," he snapped. "I shall dictate. You will sign it, preferably as a concerned culinary historian." I laughed. "Sure. I'll add that to my growing resume of aliases." "You are welcome." The crostata vanished before the hour was out. Wolfe declared it balanced, without pretense. That, coming from him, was more than enough to beat any ribbon or award. As the sun set behind the heavy curtains and the brownstone settled back into its ritual rhythm, radio murmuring in the background, kitchen quiet, air thick with citrus, "Can't spice." I sat with my notes and thought through the case one last time. A recipe stolen, a legacy nearly buried, a thief disarmed not with force but with precision. This was how Wolfe worked, not with a gun or a badge, but with logic, control, and a kind of slow-burning fury that revealed itself only in the details, the small things. The spice jar moved an inch, the flavor just too familiar. A note buried behind a wall he didn't need to shout. He never needed to stand. He just waited for the world to hand him its inconsistencies, and then piece by piece he rebuilt the truth. I closed the notebook and looked at Wolfe, who was flipping through a catalogue of exotic ferns like the past. Week hadn't included sabotage, subterfuge, and a culinary near-crisis. "Wolfe," I said. He didn't look up. "Yes, Archie? Would you have done all this if Aldo hadn't mentioned you in that letter?" A pause. He turned a page slowly. "Perhaps not." And then, without lifting his eyes, he added, "But he did." I nodded. Sometimes, that's all it takes. A name on a page, a fork in a box, a man unwilling to let something sacred be misused. Outside, the city moved on, but inside, justice had been served, and it tasted exactly right. The letter to Gastronome went out the next morning. Wolfe dictated it over eggs with chives, alternating between biting commentary and deadly precision. He didn't name Latari outright. Wolfe rarely sharpens his knives so visibly, but the implication was clear enough to turn editors pale. It went something like this. While culinary evolution is a noble pursuit, one must not mistake appropriation for innovation. The difference lies not only in method, but in memory. I signed it, a culinary historian concerned with accuracy, as instructed, and had it couriered by noon. Wolfe didn't mention it again, which was his way of marking a box complete. It was filed, not forgotten. The brownstone eased back into its usual inertia. That afternoon, Wolfe returned to his orchid rooms and emerged with a sheaf of bloom logs, needing to be re-indexed. I retreated to the front room with the intention of letting the world stay outside for a while, until the world, as it tends to do, rang the bell again. I opened the door to find Saul Panzer. Now, Saul doesn't make unannounced appearances without cause. He also doesn't wear expressions like the one he had on, guarded, skeptical, and ever so slightly amused. "Afternoon," he said. "Do you have a moment?" "For you always," I replied, stepping back to let him in. "Wolfe's with the orchids, but if this is urgent—" "Not urgent. Odd." Which, coming from Saul, meant something very odd. We moved into the office. Saul didn't sit, which was another signal. He held a folded piece of newsprint in one hand. "This came across one of my clipping services," he said, laying it flat on Wolfe's desk. "It's a restaurant write-up, local, small outlet." I looked down. It was an early online post for a pop-up food series in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Experimental, underground, exactly the kind of thing Wolfe would loathe on principle. But the name that caught me was the one printed in bold italics above the menu, Javi Molina, chef-founder. I whistled. "He bounced fast. Faster than expected," Saul said. "And the dish headlining the set menu." He tapped the paper. Spaghetti alla Harvey. I scanned the description. It was close. Not identical to the Verdicchio dish, but unmistakably descended from it, if you knew the flavors, the sequence, the bones. He'd added saffron, dropped the anchovy to a powder form, replaced breadcrumbs with garlic crisps. Flashier, flash-fried. But I'd recognized the root in a blackout. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me this wasn't over. At that moment, Wolfe entered the office. He stopped short when he saw Saul, then moved to his chair without a word. He sat, composed himself, and gestured, "Speak." Saul gave him the same update he'd given me, word for word. Wolfe listened in silence, then picked up the clipping and examined it. "The same broth," he said after a moment. "Diminished, adulterated, but evident." He dropped the paper like it had been overcooked. Ego again. A lesser thief hoping to emerge from the shadow of the first. "So what do we do?" I asked. Wolfe was still for a beat longer than usual. Then, "Nothing." That surprised even Saul. "Nothing?" I repeated. "He's pushing the same fraud, under a different name." "No," Wolfe said, voice low. "He is pushing a derivative, and in doing so he exposes himself." Saul folded his arms. "You're banking on failure?" "I am banking," Wolfe said, "on the reality that imitation, when unanchored from understanding, collapses under its own weight." He looked at me. "Archie, what is the difference between a signature dish and its mimic?" "Context," I said. "History, technique, flavor sequence. The original tells a story." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Molina does not understand the story. He remembers the shape, not the meaning, which means his dish will be received, perhaps briefly admired, and then forgotten." I wasn't sure I agreed, but I wasn't ready to argue. Wolfe might hate movement, but he understands momentum. And sometimes letting someone hang themselves with their own apron strings is the more elegant route. Still, it gnawed at me. After Saul left, I did a little digging of my own. Called a friend in the local food review scene, pulled some early comments from online threads, checked a few photos on social media. The dish was getting attention. Maybe not praise, but curiosity. The kind of "what is this" buzz that can spark into trend or burn out in a week. But one post caught my eye. It was from a food blogger known for nitpicking, someone who'd visited both Ossidiana and the Verdicchio test kitchen. She'd written, "Chef Harvey's pasta is missing a center. It's clever, yes, but like a remix of a song you don't recognize. There's something hollow under the heat." I printed that one out and brought it to Wolfe. He read it, set it aside, and said nothing for a long while. Then, "She understands." It wasn't praise, it was relief. That night, Wolfe didn't bring up the clipping again. He didn't need to. I think, in his own way, he was satisfied. Not because the dish had failed outright, but because the truth had held. In a world eager to dress up shortcuts as genius, authenticity had held its shape. The next morning, Fritz made polenta with a fried egg and grilled radicchio. Wolfe took 3 bites before pushing the plate away. "Too much heat," he murmured. "The bitterness is unbalanced." I cleared the plate and poured more coffee. "Back to the basics, huh?" He didn't answer, but I saw him glance, just for a second, at the clipped review beside him on the desk. Justice doesn't always come plated, but sometimes it lingers on the tongue long enough to matter, and Wolfe, as ever, knew how to wait. It was 4 days later, in the early slouch of a Wednesday afternoon, when the phone rang again. I had been cataloguing receipts from the last round of cab rides. Wolfe's definition of fieldwork is anything that involves me, Archie Goodwin, leaving the house, when the line buzzed with a voice I hadn't expected to hear again so soon. "This is Carlo Verdicchio," he said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're always interrupting, Carlo. That's just your natural state. What's going on?" He hesitated. "I think you might want to come downtown. There's something happening at the pop-up, Harvey's place." "Something like what?" "Something like sabotage." Now that was a word Wolfe wouldn't be able to ignore. Carlo gave me the address of the venue, a borrowed gallery space near the edge of Williamsburg's trend line, and said he'd wait outside. I hung up, gave Wolfe the summary, and waited. For the protest. It came, though not in the form I expected. I suspected as much, Wolfe said, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeve. A derivative creation that cannot sustain integrity will attract desperate measures. Go, observe, take Saul if you must. I didn't, but I noted the offer. Wolfe was hedging, and when he does that, it means we're not quite done. I grabbed my coat and hopped a cab, crossing the East River with the skyline hunched in grey over the water. The address led to a low-slung brick building, tucked between an artisanal denim shop and a bakery that sold $9 scones with hand-foraged berries. Carlo was waiting at the curb, jacket folded over one arm, looking paler than he had even the day. He came to us with the fork and the cannoli. "I'm glad you came," he said. "It's getting strange inside." Define strange. He glanced back toward the entrance. It started last night. Customers were complaining about the pasta, saying it tasted off, bitter, some kind of chemical sharpness. Did anyone get sick? No, but tonight's preview has been cancelled. Harvey's been in the back yelling. I don't think he knows what happened. Sabotage, I repeated. Not just a bad batch? He thinks someone tampered with the ingredients. That made me straighten. I'd seen a lot of ambition, a fair share of ego and no small amount of fraud. But messing with a man's food supply, especially after a scandal, that was a move out of desperation or spite. Inside, the gallery-turned-dining room was empty, except for a few half-assembled tables and a lingering scent of citrus and starch. In the open kitchen at the far end, I spotted Harvey. He was pacing hard, muttering to a sous chef with a beard that looked more decorative than practical. I walked over, and his face dropped when he saw me. "Not you," he said. "Yep," I replied. "Still me. And unless you're planning to reinvent ricin alla carbonara, I think you should tell me what's going on." He glanced at the staffer, then gestured for me to follow him into the back room, where the shelves were stacked with bins of pasta, herbs and containers of prepped sauces. "It's the broth base," he said. "It's off. I prep it myself and I keep it locked, literally locked, because of all the noise around the recipe. But last night something tasted wrong, too bitter, almost acrid. Not spoilage, just wrong." I opened the fridge. The broth tub was labelled in his handwriting. I popped the lid, sniffed. He was right. The lemon and olive oil had gone sharp, almost caustic. Not poisonous, but bad enough to send a food critic into a tirade. I dipped a pinky and tasted. No. "Salt balance," I said. And something added. "What's this, wormwood?" He blinked. "How did you—" Been around long enough to recognize the signature of sabotage with a botanical twist. Absinthe's distant cousin. You didn't put that in yourself. Of course not. And no one else has the key. Only me. But the back door locks. Cheap. I was going to replace it this weekend. I stood back and looked at him. "You're not very good at covering your flanks, Molina." He sat down on a crate, head in his hands. "I didn't want any of this," he said. "Not the interviews, the spotlight. I just wanted to prove I wasn't a dishwasher forever." "Well," I said, "you proved something." He didn't respond. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened as I reported. When I described the flavor profile of the tampered broth, his eyes narrowed just enough to make me pause mid-sentence. "Wormwood," he repeated. "That is not a mistake. That is pointed, a deliberate rendering of bitterness. Someone wanted his dish to fail, not merely to be overlooked. Public humiliation or poetic justice," Wolfe said. "And poetic justice, Archie, is rarely spontaneous." I stared at him. "You think Latari did it?" Wolfe didn't answer. He reached instead for the clipping from earlier in the week. The blogger's remark about Molina's dish tasting hollow under the heat. Latari's name has been tethered to failure, but not conclusively. If Molina were to rise in his absence, it would double the humiliation. He would wish to preempt that, especially since the current narrative paints Molina as the apprentice finally escaping the master's shadow. Indeed, Wolfe said. If he cannot own the story, he will destroy it. I nodded slowly. Want me to call Saul? Call Saul, Wolfe said, and call Marta Rossetti. I believe she's recently begun work at a test kitchen for the book project. Why her? Because bitterness in a broth base is chemical, but the bitterness in a man's act, that must be confirmed by character, I called. Marta picked up on the second ring and confirmed what Wolfe suspected. Enzo Latari had tried to contact her earlier that week. He'd asked about Carlo's plans, hinted at a possible rebranding opportunity, and, curiously, had inquired if she knew where Molina was sourcing his ingredients. Marta hadn't answered him, but she had saved the voicemail. Wolfe listened to it that evening. His expression didn't change, but I caught the glint in his eye when Latari's voice said, "We can't let imitators rewrite what we started. That recipe was ours to elevate." He didn't say mine. He said ours. Slip? Or maybe a confession in disguise. Wolfe poured himself a glass of beer, leaned back and said, "We need one more thing. Not proof of sabotage, reason. Find out who sold him the wormwood." Took me most of the next day and 3 phone calls to obscure spice vendors in Queens. But eventually I found one who remembered selling culinary-grade wormwood extract to a man in a blue blazer who paid cash and asked if it would mask lemon oils. He'd used an alias, but the description? Spot on. That night, I returned to the brownstone with a receipt and a quiet sense of inevitability. Wolfe read it. Then, without a word, he handed me a new envelope. Inside was a card already addressed, "To Chef Enzo Latari," it read. "Flavor tells the truth. Yours is beginning to speak." No signature, just an old Verdicchio family stamp, pressed in. X. Wolfe closed his eyes, folded his arms, and said, "Now it's done." And maybe, for once, it really was. It was Saturday evening when the letter came, thin, cream-colored, and embossed. It wasn't dramatic, but it didn't need to be. Wolfe read it at his desk while sipping beer and pushing away what remained of Fritz's duck à l'orange, which had offended him earlier for being too forward with the zest. He read the letter once. Then he read it again. Then he passed it to me with the casual air of someone flicking a speck of lint from his sleeve. I read it twice because I didn't trust my eyes the first time. To Mr. Nero Wolfe, per our recent discussion, I accept your terms. I will be removing any claim to the spaghetti recipe from my restaurant's public materials and issuing a private acknowledgement to the Verdicchio estate. I trust this will conclude the matter. Respectfully, Enzo Latari. No press. No courtroom. No headlines, just surrender, private, quiet, and complete. I lowered the letter. Well, you pulled him apart without even raising your voice. I raised facts, Wolfe said, which are louder. The next day, Carlo came to the brownstone for the last time. He looked better, lighter, if that makes sense. He handed Wolfe a small wrapped package and then glanced at me with something like a smile. "We've decided to go forward with the relaunch," he said. "No flash, no fake nostalgia, just the original recipes. Marta's on board. And the first chapter of the book will reprint my father's handwritten broth note." "Good," Wolfe said without looking up. "That broth is a fingerprint." "I'll send you a signed copy," Carlo added. Wolfe made a face like the idea offended his shelf space. "Don't." We shook hands anyway, and when Carlo left he seemed like someone who'd finally stopped carrying something that had been heavy too long. That evening, Wolfe let Fritz serve spaghetti alla Verdicchio again. No flair, no tweaks, just the original, the way Aldo wrote it. Anchovy, lemon leaf, toasted crumbs, a broth that didn't shout but lingered like memory. I had seconds. Wolfe did not. He ate slowly, and when Fritz cleared the plates, Wolfe lifted. His beer took a sip and sighed. Bitterness, he said, is best left on the palate, not the tongue. He didn't say it like a line, just a thought he'd let out because it was true. I closed the case file that night, not with a bang, but with the click of a folder that didn't need reopening. Wolfe hadn't saved a life, but he'd salvaged something else, a legacy. A man's work, stolen in silence, now returned by intellect, pressure, and the inevitability of truth. No arrests, no shouting, just flavor, restored. And in Wolfe's world, that's justice, the kind that lasts.